On April 30th, 2026, Donald Trump sat in the Oval Office and signed a presidential permit for a brand new oil pipeline from Canada into the United States. He looked up at the cameras, grinned, and said, "Slightly different from the last administration. They wouldn't sign a pipeline deal, and we have pipelines going up." The room laughed. White House Staff Secretary Will Scharf called it a huge deal in terms of long-term energy dominance and energy security. Alberta Premier Danielle Smith posted it on social media within the hour, calling it incredible news for Alberta producers. And the Canadian government's response was one carefully worded sentence from a spokesperson. Not the Prime Minister, not the Energy Minister, a spokesperson. That single scripted response tells you everything you need to understand about the strategic shockwave this permit just sent through Ottawa. This moment is a stark departure from the established energy dynamic. For nearly 2 decades, cross-border pipeline projects have been defined by political gridlock and regulatory rejection. Most notably, on his first day in office in 2021, the Biden administration revoked the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline, effectively killing a project that would have carried 830,000 barrels per day. But on April 30th, that pattern was reversed with a grin and a signature. This reversal moves the Continental energy narrative away from climate-focused obstruction and toward Trump's stated goal of energy dominance. That dominance is rooted in a fundamental dependency. Canada is the single largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States. In 2024, Canada sent roughly 4.1 million barrels per day south across the border. That accounted for about 62% of all American crude imports and roughly 24% of total U.S. refinery feedstock. Crucially, 96% of all Canadian crude exports went to one customer, the United States. That structure, where nearly all product is locked into a single market, is a strategic dependency for Ottawa, and this new pipeline is designed to deepen it. Washington understands this dependency perfectly. American refineries, especially in the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast, were specifically calibrated to process the heavy, high-sulfur crude that comes from Alberta's oil sands. Since 2010, Canada has expanded its share of those specific refinery markets by approximately 200%. The physical infrastructure, the pipelines, and the multi-billion-dollar refinery complex are entirely calibrated for Canadian heavy crude. This physical integration means every new barrel of capacity heading south into the American system makes it structurally more difficult for Canada to redirect that oil anywhere else. The project itself is engineered to lock in this structural integration. The expansion is a joint venture between the American company Bridger Pipeline, a subsidiary of the True Family's oil empire based in Casper, Wyoming, and South Bow. The Canadian company spun off from TC Energy in 2024. This detail tells you that the same players are involved in this project, just with a new configuration. The South Bow piece, called the Prairie Connector, would leverage roughly 150 kilometers of Keystone XL pipe already in the ground in Alberta, specifically engineered to deliver crude to the Bridger line at the Montana border. The presidential permit grants Bridger permission to build and operate these facilities, confirming that the southern route is now permitted and ready to begin. The construction timeline reveals the deliberate planning. Work is expected to start in the fall of 2027 and be completed by late 2028 or early 2029, strategically timed to finish just before Trump's term ends in January 2029. This engineering schedule makes the project much harder to reverse. Because Bridger is designing this schedule around past political setbacks, more than 70% of the route will be built within existing pipeline corridors, 80% runs across private land, and it does not cross any Native American reservations. This strategic route planning avoids the precise political vulnerabilities that led to the legal and public relations disasters that destroyed Keystone XL. The implications extend far beyond the immediate economic benefits. Heather Exner-Pyra, a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, noted that this pipeline could increase Canada's crude exports to the United States by more than 12%. This fact is being framed by multiple analysts as a potential bargaining chip for Mark Carney heading into the CUSMA review scheduled for July 2026. Canada's Energy Minister, Tim Hodgson, said publicly in April that Canada's position as an energy exporter is its strongest card in trade talks with Washington. This detail tells you that Ottawa views this increased capacity as strategic leverage. But here is the central strategic contradiction. The stronger card for Canada in any trade negotiation is the ability to sell that oil to an alternative buyer, not the ability to sell more of it to the same customer who already has you over a barrel. Every new pipeline heading south increases American leverage, as it guarantees the flow of critical feedstock to American refineries. And this is exactly why the Bridger pipeline competes directly for the same barrels of oil that would fill Canada's proposed Pacific pipeline. Peter Tertsakian, deputy director of the Arc Energy Research Institute, explicitly flagged that if a producer commits large volumes to the Bridger expansion, they risk being unable to ship as much on other pipelines, including a new line to the West Coast. Canadian producers are being forced to choose between dependency or diversification, and the Bridger permit just put a construction-ready option for dependency on the table before the diversification route has even cleared its first regulatory hurdle. But the most consequential question, the one Canada's oil industry is watching with intense strategic scrutiny, was still unanswered. The strategic leverage of this trade relationship depends entirely on who controls the directional gravity of Canada's oil. As established, Washington's rapid approval of the Bridger expansion creates a permanent infrastructure link that locks Canadian supply into the American refinery network, short-circuiting Ottawa's long-term plan to diversify its customer base. By providing a permitted, low-resistance route south, the White House has placed a concrete option on the table for producers, directly challenging Canada's parallel attempt to build an independent path to the Pacific coast. That sequence is not coincidental. It is a direct policy statement intended to secure American energy dominance before the broader terms of continental trade are renegotiated. The structural blueprint of the Bridger project reveals how Washington is leveraging existing corporate assets to accelerate this timeline. On May 11, 2026, South Bow Corporation, the Canadian infrastructure firm spun off from TC Energy, confirmed it was finalizing a 60-day commercial open season for its piece of the project, known as the Prairie Connector. That commercial phase aims to secure long-term shipping commitments for 450,000 barrels per day of capacity, moving from Hardisty, Alberta, directly to the Montana border. What this commercial alignment reveals is that despite political hesitation in Ottawa, the private sector mechanisms required to pipe Canadian crude south are already functioning at high speed. This means the economic momentum of the southern route is actively outpacing the diplomatic timeline of the Canadian state. RBNenergy.com may show 1. This private sector speed contrasts sharply with the complex legislative compromises backing Canada's alternative West Coast pipeline. On May 15, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed a formal implementation agreement in Calgary, outlining a pathway to begin construction on a 1 million barrel per day Pacific pipeline by September 1, 2027. To achieve this, the federal government committed to pursuing a national interest designation under the Building Canada Act by October 1, 2026, which would fast-track environmental reviews and alter carbon pricing schedules for Alberta industry. This domestic political maneuvering shows how far Ottawa is willing to bend its own regulatory frameworks to build an economic counterweight to the United States. What that agreement does structurally is attempt to artificially accelerate a Pacific route that lacks the ready-made corporate infrastructure enjoyed by its American competitor. EnergyNow.ca. The geopolitical urgency behind this domestic alignment became clear during the recent shock to the global energy system. The outbreak of the Iran war on February 20, 2026, which effectively blockaded the Strait of Hormuz, drove global oil prices past $120 a barrel and triggered a historic 400 million barrel emergency reserve release by the International Energy Agency. During this crisis, Western Canadian Select surged past $90 a barrel, and Canadian crude exports to the United States jumped 21% year over year in April. That supply shock proved exactly why American refineries require an uninterrupted, continental supply of heavy crude to stabilize domestic fuel prices. This tells you that Washington's rapid approval of the Bridger pipeline was a direct national security response to Middle Eastern instability, designed to permanently insulate the American economy from overseas vulnerabilities at Canada's expense. ca.finance@yahoo.com, however, the diplomatic rhetoric surrounding this continental integration remains deeply divided over who actually holds the upper hand. Following the Bridger permit signing, Charlotte Power, a spokesperson for Canadian Energy Minister Tim Hodgson, has issued a statement declaring, "The Government of Canada remains focused on strengthening Canada's position as an energy superpower." What that response reveals is a deliberate choice not to close the door on American infrastructure, even as Ottawa tries to market its upcoming West Coast project as an assertion of independence. This contradiction highlights the dual reality of Canadian energy policy, attempting to play the role of a sovereign global exporter while continuously expanding the infrastructure that binds its economy to a single domestic market. w.souljournal.net. The financial reality of this binding infrastructure is measured in billions of dollars of lost leverage. Over the past 15 years, the lack of alternative export routes to international tidewater has forced Canadian producers to accept recurring price discounts against American benchmarks, resulting in an estimated $49 billion in forfeited revenue. A million-barrel-per-day pipeline to the Pacific coast is projected to reverse this trend, adding $16 billion to Canadian gross domestic product and generating $5 billion in new provincial royalties annually. That economic data demonstrates why the Pacific Pipeline is an existential priority for Ottawa's long-term fiscal health. This means every barrel of oil instead diverted into the newly permitted Bridger system directly reduces the financial viability of Canada's diversification strategy. The ultimate success of either strategy now hinges on a critical domestic deadline that will test the unity of the Canadian Federation. Under the terms of the May 15th implementation agreement, the Alberta government is required to submit its formal, comprehensive pipeline proposal to the Federal Major Projects Office by July 1st, 2026. This submission will occur under intense political pressure, as British Columbia Premier David Eby remains diametrically opposed to the route, and the formal CUSMA trade review is scheduled to begin exactly on the same day. But the more consequential question, the one continental energy markets are watching with intense strategic scrutiny, is whether Alberta can deliver a unified provincial proposal before the overlapping pressures of the trade war and provincial opposition stall the Pacific route permanently. Navigating the intersecting timelines of the continental trade war, corporate infrastructure readiness, and raw geographic friction reveals that this pipeline standoff is not a standard regulatory dispute. The overlapping developments of mid-2026 have transformed a baseline infrastructure bottleneck into a high-stakes chess match over national sovereignty and market control. By injecting a permitted, cost-efficient route directly into the American market, Washington has fundamentally challenged Canada's long-term strategy to break its single customer dependency. The resolution of this friction will dictate the structural flow of North American energy wealth for the next quarter century, leaving zero room for miscalculation in either capital for Canada. The rapid acceleration of the southern route alters the core math of its economic autonomy. Striking a compromise with Alberta on industrial carbon pricing and fast-tracked environmental legislation demonstrates a historic federal commitment to building a Pacific trade corridor. Yet that domestic effort remains severely undermined as long as the corporate sector finds an easier, permitted alternative pointing south. If Canadian oil producers commit their capital and long-term volumes to filling the Bridger expansion, the economic viability of a multi-billion-dollar Pacific pipeline will evaporate before a single shovelful of earth is turned in British Columbia. What this structural trap means for Ottawa is that its theoretical negotiating leverage at the upcoming Continental Trade Review is actively shrinking with every joint venture agreement signed by its own domestic producers. Conversely, The United States has successfully consolidated its position of asymmetric dominance without firing a shot or spending public capital. By approving the Bridger expansion on a timeline designed to outlast the current presidency, Washington has guaranteed a steady expanded flow of heavy feedstock to secure its own industrial stability. This move permanently lowers input costs for American refineries while systematically draining the supply pool needed to make Canada's diversification strategy feasible. That outcome isolates the Canadian energy sector, keeping its vast resources struck captive within the American market. This reality gives the White House an unassailable advantage heading into the broader trade renegotiations, as it leaves Canada with no viable economic alternative but to accept Washington's terms. This continental consolidation also sends clear ripples through the broader global economy, specifically affecting energy-hungry markets in Asia and traditional allies in Europe. For major industrial importers like India and China, the potential strangulation of Canada's Pacific route means a critical window for energy diversification is rapidly closing. Instead of securing a massive, stable supply of non-OPEC crude directly from a Pacific tidewater, these Asian economies remain completely dependent on volatile maritime choke points that are constantly vulnerable to geopolitical shocks. This tells you that Washington's swift infrastructure play does not just secure domestic refineries. It actively prevents its primary economic rivals from accessing a secure, alternative energy baseline that could power their own industrial expansion. The final overarching reality of this infrastructure battle is that supply chains dictate the boundaries of political sovereignty. The underlying pattern of the North American energy trade shows that agreements, press conferences, and legislative frameworks are entirely subservient to the physical reality of steel in the ground. By moving first to permit the Bridger expansion, the United States has effectively used private corporate momentum to short-circuit the sovereign trade ambitions of the Canadian state. The long-term trajectory of this relationship will not be decided by who holds the most valuable resource, but by who controls the physical direction of its flow. As long as the pipelines run south, the economic gravity of the continent will continue to pull toward Washington, transforming Canada's greatest asset into its permanent economic anchor.